Welcome to this trip down the dusty back roads of the countryside through one of the most unsettling stories ever told. We're going to tell you something that will undermine your beliefs about what is genuine and what isn't. So, please comment on where you're watching us from now on. This film was made entirely for amusement and as a work of fiction. Any similarity to real people living or deceased is entirely coincidental. Imagine being stuck on a road in Missouri's Ozarks Mountains. The year. The Great War is raging outside in 1917. However, time appears to stop differently here in this neglected corner of America. The morning mist spreads across the ground like something alive, and the trees enclose the trails like entwined fingers. Two travelers, a couple passing through, will encounter something in this environment that is incomprehensible. In search of employment in the sawmills that were still in operation close to the Arkansas River, they traveled south from Springfield. Border. What transpired that evening is more important than their names. She worked as a tailor. He knew wood, common people, those who trusted what they saw and felt. People who never thought reality could be so twisted. At that time of year, the afternoon passed swiftly, and they were certain that they would not get at their goal before dusk. The roads were dangerous, littered with exposed roots and loose stones. The cart creaked at every pothole, and their horse was exhausted. At that point, between the woods, they could see smoke rising, a sliver of pale gray against the skies fading. People can be found anywhere there is smoke. There is shelter where people are present. They turned off the main route onto a well-traveled side path and followed the smoke. The wheel tracks showed that someone had recently traveled through the area because they were buried deep in the ground. This gave them comfort. On a bustling road, nobody expects to find the impossible. After a sharp bend, the cabin emerged, constructed of black timbers, with an uneven set of boards for a roof. It had the appearance of a place that had seen many generations go by. It was sturdy and ancient. Orange light peeked through the window's gaps, and smoke rose from the stone chimney. As was customary in the countryside, they got off the cart and walked gently toward them. You have to be careful when knocking on a stranger's door at night. The man knocked 3 times, gently but strongly. Nobody responded. He knocked once more, quiet. However, the door was unlocked, and upon gently pushing it, the old hinges groaned as it opened. Everything appeared to be inhabited inside. Unwashed dishes and still warm leftover food were on a table. Muddy boots beside the entry, folded blankets in a corner, pots hanging on the wall, and a rocking chair close to the fireplace where the fire was still crackling softly. There was a resident. There was no question about that. However, where was that individual? They called, waited, and then called once more. Nothing. The trees began to whisper as the wind blew outside, and the sense that they were being watched intensified. With every second that went by, yet fatigue triumphed over terror. They had no other option. The horse needed to rest, and the night was cold. They remained. After tending to the fire and eating what they had brought, they took a seat beneath the blankets they had discovered. The woman remarked that it was odd that the door was unlocked before turning in for the night. "Country folk trust their neighbors," her husband retorted. She didn't seem to be persuaded, but she fell asleep fast. It was the kind of heavy, deep slumber that appears to drain you. Down. The first thing they noticed when they woke up was that it was much colder than it had been the night before. The light was the second detail. Light is abundant, too much for a closed cabin. The final detail was then revealed, and it completely altered the situation. They had no roof over their heads. They were surrounded by no walls. There was no window, no door, and no chimney. The same blankets enveloped them as they lay in the midst of an open clearing with only trees and the sky around them. The cabin was no longer there, and, With it, any assurance that the night before had actually happened. Still encased in the blankets they had discovered the previous evening, the pair rose slowly. They were there, smelled like wood smoke, and were really harsh to the touch. However, there was nothing but tall grass waving in the morning breeze where the dark wood cabin should have been. Around that area, the trees formed a perfect circle, as though they had been intentionally planted to create an imperceptible border. The woman put her hands on the ground, looking for any evidence that the building had previously existed, such as burnt wood traces or evidence of a foundation. Nothing. Moss and fallen leaves that appeared to have been there for years blanketed the unspoiled ground. Not even the ashes from the fire that had burnt all night in the fireplace were present. The husband circled the area, mentally calculating the locations of the door, window, and walls. He moved deliberately and slowly, as though he still anticipated coming across something solid. Thing was invisible to his sight. At that moment, he became aware of something disturbing. The wagon was tethered to a tree at the clearing's edge, just where they had left it. The distance was off, yet the horse grazed calmly, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. They had left the cart a little distance from the cabin door the night before. Now that they were at least 20 meters away from their sleeping spot, it seemed as though the environment had changed overnight, retaining some aspects while eliminating others. The woman started breathing and moving in circles, quickly, searching for a logical explanation. Maybe they had slept somewhere else. It's possible that they woke up far from the cottage after wandering around in their sleep. However, the blankets were present, and they vividly recalled dozing off close to the fire while taking in the sound of the wood crackling. They couldn't have shared a dream because their recollections were so clear. The sun rose swiftly, bringing light and warmth but no solace. They made the decision to search for the path that had brought them there. If they could locate the detour, the one, they could get back to the main road and get out of there with deep wheel tracks. However, when they arrived at the trail's intended location, they discovered nothing but thick bushes, tangled branches, and a tangle of vegetation that appeared to have been left undisturbed for a very long time. The man used his hands to snap branches and push aside undergrowth in an attempt to clear a route. The plants were hardy, moist, and covered in dew. He stopped after a few minutes. His hands were scratched, and he became aware that he was. He entered a woodland he didn't recognize and moved farther and farther away from the clearing. With a shaky voice, the woman shouted back to him. Instead of panicking, they needed to think. They went back to the horse's location and used the sun to try to orient themselves. They had to go south as they were aware that they had come from the north. However, the surrounding woodland lacked distinguishable landmarks and was too homogeneous. Every tree has the same appearance. The shadows were all the same. And the quiet was deafening. No birds were singing. There were no buzzing insects, just a steady, chilly wind that seemed to blow from everywhere at once. They became aware of the footprints at that point. They didn't own them. The soft ground next to the clearing had the imprints of heavy boots. They moved in a circle, as though someone had made multiple laps around the area where they slept, staying at the same distance each time. The terror that the couple had suppressed up until that point started to surface as they exchanged glances. Throughout the night, someone had been there. They were unguarded and unaware that someone had been watching them as they slept. Her husband insisted on following the footprints even though the wife wanted to leave right away. They might lead the perpetrator to someone who could explain the situation. They hurriedly got the cart ready, tucked up the blankets that appeared to be the cabin's last tangible remnant, and started down the trail. Their tracks followed a trail through the trees that appeared to lead them out of the clearing. To spiral. The surroundings altered more and more as they progressed. As the trees got older and larger, their massive trunks prevented 3 individuals from encircling them. The ground was covered in a thick covering of dead leaves that muffled any sound, and sunlight hardly made it through the dense canopy. The tracks kept going, always in front of you, always in sight, like they wanted to be followed until they came to a place where they just stopped. There was only a circle of firmly packed earth, nothing more. Smooth and devoid of vegetation. A chunk of burned wood was embedded in the earth in the middle of that region. It still had hand-carved marks and appeared to be a portion of a beam. The man dropped to his knees and touched the wood. Even though it was chilly, there was a strong smell of burning. The timber was identical to that found in the cabin. He was certain of it. Some residual energy seemed to pulse through the burnt wood in the man's hands. He flipped it over and studied the odd geometric patterns made by the carvings. They weren't typical ornaments. He had never seen an alphabet, but they appeared to be symbols. The woman came up and wanted to look, but as soon as she touched the charcoal surface, her fingers began to heat up. She dropped the wood right away, and the two of them saw it fall to the ground, creating a tiny dust cloud. They could hear their own breathing in the absolute silence that surrounded them. The horse, who had obeyed up until that point, started to exhibit signs of anxiety. It tugged at its eyes were big, as animals do when they see danger, and it shook its head. The man ran his fingers up the animal's neck in an attempt to calm it down, but this only made matters worse. The horse retreated a short distance, nearly toppling the cart. They heard it at that moment, a deep, low sound that sounded as if it were coming from below ground. They felt a tremor in their bones instead of a sound, similar to the far-off rumble of a massive object passing through the depths. The pair relocated, moving away from the circular clearing's center in search of the tree's safety. The sound appeared to go on forever for a few seconds before abruptly ceasing as abruptly as it had started. Their hearts were racing as they waited, but nothing came of it. The stifling silence of the jungle returned. The man tried to figure out how much time they had lost by staring up at the sky. It was already lunchtime, and the sun was already higher than it should have been. They had risen early. He was certain of it. However, it suddenly appeared as though, in the blink of an eye, hours had gone by. There, time was acting strangely. The woman advised them to give up on everything and just decide which way to go. As long as it will get them out of there, any direction will do. However, the man's attention was drawn to the burned wood. He was drawn in by something about it. He had the impression that everything would make sense if he could decipher those symbols. Ignoring the uncomfortable heat, he scooped it up again and slipped it inside his shirt. Maybe they could, as soon as they left, show it to someone. Someone has the ability to read the signs. They went back to the wagon and made the decision to go in the opposite direction of the footprints. There had to be a way out if someone had circled them in that manner, entering and leaving the woodland. The reasoning was straightforward, yet using reasoning there seemed more and more pointless. It was all they had, though. As they progressed, the vegetation started to alter. Younger pines replaced the older trees, and the ground became more uneven, with many of stones covered in lichen. The stench of wet ground and rotting foliage also altered the air, making it more humid. They seemed to be moving through various woodland strata, each with a distinct character and ambiance. They arrived at a creek after a period of time neither of them could precisely calculate. The oppressive calm was finally broken by the sound of the water running smoothly over rounded stones. Thirsty, the horse drew toward the water, and they led it to drink while they took a little break. The woman felt some relief from the coolness of the water as she moistened her cheeks and hands. The spouse followed suit, and for a moment they thought it had all been a weird nightmare. However, he noticed something that made his stomach turn when he gazed at the moving water. The outline of a skyscraper was reflected on the surface behind them. He spun around, but nothing was there. Trees, and more trees. He glanced back at the lake. The vision of the smoke-filled, dark log home was still there, distinct and unclouded, like the previous evening, blowing from the chimney. Pointing to the reflection, he cried out to the woman. She noticed the same thing when she looked. Both of them watched that impossibility, paralyzed. The cabin did not exist in the physical world, but it did exist in the sea. The stream appeared to be displaying something from a different era, location, or even just a different facet of the same reality. Slowly, the woman's hand touched the water's surface. The image shuddered and warped, but did not vanish. Even he thought the man's notion was ridiculous. In the center of the cabin's reflection, he grabbed a stone off the ground and tossed it into the lake. For a moment, the vision vanished entirely as the stone sunk and splashed in. However, the reflection reappeared as the water subsided, displaying a new image. The cabin door was ajar, and a shadowy, dark figure stood in the doorway, observing. They departed from the stream right away, going back to the cart. The horse was restless once more, snorting and stamping its hooves on the ground, as if it had detected something. They had to leave quickly, but they weren't sure which way to go, follow the stream. There has to be a destination. There is always a destination for rivers. But what if this stream wasn't like the others? What if it took them farther into that unreachable woodland? The choice was made by the man. They would defy the prevailing trend. Rivers come from the mountains and descend into the valleys. They would ultimately arrive to a high point where they could see the horizon, get their bearings, spot smoke coming from another house, or any other indication of civilization if they continued upstream. That was all they had, and it was a sensible idea. It was a challenging climb. Because the cart wasn't designed for hard terrain, they had to stop multiple times to push when the horse couldn't handle it on its own, or to pull the wheels out of holes. Because the sun was shining, the hours seemed to go by. Remaining at that peculiar position in the sky, neither fully rising nor fully setting. The day seemed to have stopped in its tracks. The stream eventually dwindled to a little trickle of water between the stones before being engulfed by the ground and became extinct. They had arrived at the source, but all they saw was more woodland instead of a mountain or sweeping vista. This was the only area of the forest that was different. The trees in this area were lifeless, drab, bare-trunked, leafless, and rose like enormous skeletons, in opposition to the sky. There were deep slashes made in the wood by a sharp tool among those dead trunks. They weren't arbitrary. The burnt wood the man still held against his chest was etched with the same symbols that they created. Tree after tree displayed the same geometric patterns, as though someone had written an unreadable message there. It was emotional tiredness, not despair, that caused the woman to start crying quietly. They were stuck in an unfollowable place. Regular rules, driven by something they were unable to see or comprehend, and every move they made seemed to just draw them farther into that enigma. Feeling the same weight, her spouse gave her a hug while attempting to maintain some optimism. They heard footsteps at that moment. Other footfall might be heard somewhere among the dead trees, not the sound they made. Approaching footsteps were slow and deliberate. The couple just listened while standing motionless and without breathing. The footsteps ceased. Next, after a moment of silence, they heard a voice. They were unable to read the text. Although it sounded more like a whisper, it was unmistakably a human voice or something attempting to seem like one. The voice echoed among the dead tree trunks, a murmur that appeared to emanate from multiple directions at once. The words had a cadence, like an old hymn or a forgotten prayer, yet they were incomprehensible. The pair stood motionless, searching for the source of the noise. The voice occasionally appeared to be very near, whispering next to them, and occasionally far away, emanating from a location deep into the forest. The man motioned for the woman to slowly go back to the cart. They walked in unison, taking care not to foot on any dry branches that could produce noise. The horse remained motionless, its ears perked forward in anticipation of something they were unable to see. The voice abruptly stopped as they got closer to the animal. Even more disturbing than the murmur was the silence that ensued. They held their breath and waited, but nothing came of it. There was silence, no sound, no movement among the trees. It seemed as though whatever was there had just disappeared or was merely awaiting their next move. The man got on the cart and assisted the woman in getting up. They had to get moving. It was harder to stand motionless than to go in the wrong path. He picked the path that appeared to be the most open and led the horse through the dead tree trunks. The light was starting to shift once more, turning a deeper shade of golden, as though the day was, finally making headway in the latter part of the afternoon. However, how long had it actually been since they had woken up? Hours? An entire day? Both of them were hungry, but they lacked the guts to stop and eat. After a while, the dead tree forest gave way to a patch of scrub, sparse vegetation, and long grass that brushed the wagon's wheels. This was a flatter area, and they could see a little farther for the first time since they had woken up in that difficult clearing. In the distance there was what appeared to be a structure among the greenery, an abandoned barn, another cabin. From a distance it was difficult to tell. Her husband shook his head as the woman gestured to the building. Their alternatives were limited. They either went in its direction and hoped to discover whatever it was, or they kept roaming until nightfall once more, and the thought of spending another night there, especially after what had happened the first time, was intolerable. As they got closer, the building turned into more lucid. Unlike the hut where they had slept, it was a house. With 2 floors and a veranda around the front, this one was bigger. Age had worn down the timber. The windows were black as voids, and some of the planks were loose. No chimneys were emitting smoke. Not a trace of life. For years, it appeared to be deserted. They got off the cart after stopping it at a safe distance. The man grabbed a piece of wood off the ground to use as a leaning surface rather than a weapon, something firm to cling to. The wooden steps creaked under their feet as they made their way slowly to the porch. The wind had started to blow, and the entrance door was ajar that swayed slightly. The house was in shambles inside. A table that was flipped on its side, shattered furniture, and ripped drapes dangling from the windows. It appeared to have been hastily abandoned, as though its occupants had fled and never come back. However, there was an oddity. There was no dust in spite of the devastation. It was all too spotless for a place, abandoned for a very long time. While her husband looked around the living room, the woman went into the kitchen. Plates of leftover food that appeared to be relatively fresh were piled in the sink. Water was half full in a pot on the stove. There were glasses on the table. One of them fell to the ground. It seemed as though someone had visited there recently, possibly even that day. However, who? And why would they abandon everything in that state? Each step creaked under the man's weight as he ascended the stairs to the second floor. The upstairs hallway had 3 locked doors and was small and dark. When he opened the first, he saw a room that was empty except for a bed that had no sheets and a broken window that let the wind in. The third door was locked, but the second door opened to reveal a similar scene, peeling walls and another empty room. The door refused to move despite his repeated attempts to turn the doorknob and push with his shoulder. On the other side, there was something. He sensed it. A presence rather than a particular sound, such as when you. Even if you are unable to see anyone, you are aware that they are observing you. He listened, breathing, while pressing his ear against the wood. On the other side, someone was breathing. His heart thumping, he backed away and dashed down the steps. The woman was still looking at the dishes in the kitchen when he arrived. He took hold of her arm and said in a quiet, urgent voice that they had to go right away. She didn't ask him any questions. Something was seriously wrong, and she could see it in his face. They dashed back to the cart after leaving through the front door. However, they heard the front door slam just as they were ready to head upstairs. When they turned to look behind them, they noticed that the front door, where they had left ajar, was now fully closed, and that a figure stood motionless on the porch, observing them. It looked to be a tall man wearing dark clothing, though details were hard to see in the distance and the shifting light. The couple didn't wait to find out more. The man whipped the res after they got into the cart, causing the horse to bolt. The cart swayed dangerously over the uneven ground as they drove as quickly as they could away from that house. They turned to see that the figure had remained in the same spot, merely observing their escape. They continued to ride for an endless amount of time, avoiding dense woods and traversing grassy fields. The fear of spending another night outside intensified as the sky started to truly darken. However, it was not possible to stop close to that house. They needed to locate a different location that appeared secure. They had to slow down as night swiftly descended. The horse was breathing heavily and had foam at the corners of its mouth due to exhaustion. They came to a stop in a little clearing that was just as surrounded by trees as the one where they had woken up. For fear of drawing notice, they refrained from starting a fire. All they did was wrap themselves in their blankets and watch the shadows dance among the trunks while they lay awake with their eyes open. It was a long night without sleep. They shuddered at every sound. There seemed to be danger in every tree movement, but nothing materialized. There were no strange voices, no figures coming out of the shadows, no cabins coming and going, just the steady wind and the sound of leaves rustling. They got up and got everything ready to go on as the first rays of dawn started to illuminate the sky. The man examined the blackened wood he was still holding against his chest. That odd warmth was gone, and it was cold now. The engraved symbols appeared less distinct, as though they were starting to fade. When he showed it to the woman, they both silently thought the same thing. As though it didn't want anyone to ever know what had actually happened there, that location was wiping evidence and making things vanish. A thick fog appeared in the morning and spread like a sea of milk across the earth. The couple made the decision to proceed, relying solely on their gut feelings to guide them. The horse moved cautiously and slowly as though it felt that. There was something unreliable about the surroundings. The trees materialized only when they were a few meters distant, emerging from the mist like ghosts. The woman became aware of something odd in her own thoughts during this quiet stroll. The recollections of the cabin where they had spent the night were starting to fade, like though they belonged to someone else. She could recall that they had gone inside, seen a fireplace, and slept under blankets. But when she attempted to concentrate on the specifics, she couldn't remember. Them. What kind of walls were they? What was the number of windows? She was no longer able to respond with confidence. When she told her spouse about it, he admitted that he felt the same way. It seemed as though that location was gradually robbing him of his memories, substituting uncertainty for certainty. The burned wood was nearly smooth when he touched it again. The engravings faded to tiny dots that might represent anything. Maybe nothing would be left in a few more hours to indicate that those symbols had ever been there. As the dawn rose, the fog started to clear, and they could see that they were on a true dirt road, with deep tire tracks and even some footprints from horse hooves. They were incredibly relieved. Roads lead to civilization, locations, and people. With a fresh sense of hope, they turned toward the path that appeared to be most utilized. The route wound through overgrown, low hills. They observed evidence of typical human activity for the first time in what felt like days. A stone sign there, a shattered fence here, and an even side. Paths indicating farms in the area. They started to think that maybe they had finally broken free from that nightmare as the world began to make sense once more. However, this sense of normalcy was fleeting. They started to sense something unsettling as they continued down the road. As might be expected on a busy road, the wheel traces they followed were not from many carts. The tracks were consistently the same, repeated repeatedly, as though they were following their own tracks or the same cart had gone by several times. In circles. The man paused and descended to take a closer look at the footprints. Something about them stood out. One of the wheels had an imperfection that created a distinctive pattern in the mud. It was precisely the same design as the wheel, with the tiny rim crack on the cart. They were going in their own direction. However, how? They had never been on the route before, they were certain. The woman also descended and proceeded a short distance ahead, surveying the landscape. The rails went on, never changing, following. Around a bend ahead, the road vanished. Even if it was unfeasible, the earth demonstrated it. They noticed the identical tracks when they turned to face the path they had come from. They were stuck in a never-ending cycle of self-following. The man felt panic take hold of his chest. He scaled a big boulder next to the road in an attempt to have a better view and look for any landmark that may aid in their orientation. He could see past the surrounding hills from the summit, and what he saw chilled his blood. The scenery was repeated. Like reflections in an endless mirror, the same hills, the same tree arrangement, and the same shapes are repeated in every direction. After leaving, he told the woman what he had witnessed. The two stood in the center of the road, attempting to comprehend the significance of everything. Not only were they imprisoned there, but they were also imprisoned in a warped universe in which time and space no longer operated normally. They might be returning to where they started with each stride they take. Every decision could be pointless. At that moment, they heard hooves approaching. A horse emerged trotting along the road, towing a cart from the other direction. But fear struck in as the figure approached. Their own cart was being pulled by their own horse. And there they were, sitting just as they were now, two incarnations of the same couple driving toward one another. The original pair watched their doubles approach, paralyzed. Additionally, the other version of them paused, gazing with the same expression of astonishment and incredulity. The two pairs gazed at each other, live reflections of each other, for what seemed like an eternity. The twin form then started to dissipate, turning translucent like smoke, and eventually disappeared entirely without any sound or abrupt movement. The woman shook and dropped to her knees. This was excessive. It was more than her mind could handle to see herself, knowing that they were somehow coming together via the impossibly tight spaces of that location. Her spouse assisted her. To her feet, finding it difficult to keep his cool. It was time for them to leave before they went entirely insane. They decided not to follow any track, and left the road and headed directly into the bush. Maybe the solution was to completely abandon the designated routes if the roads took them in circles. They regularly had to climb down to push or cut branches with a knife they brought when the cart became trapped in the thick undergrowth. Once more, the sun was peculiar, that identical frozen spot in the sky that they had previously observed. They came to the conclusion that they could no longer rely on the weather. It was unclear to them whether it was morning or afternoon. They hadn't seen their doubles for hours or minutes. Around them, reality was utterly disjointed. They eventually arrived at a deep valley surrounded by sheer stone walls. There was a layer of mist on the valley bottom that stayed in place like a solid carpet. The tops of trees could be seen rising from the mist beneath, resembling islands in a white sea. A tiny pathway that zigzagged down the rock's side was the only way down. After everything they had witnessed, They had no desire to go down into that murk. However, they discovered that the valley curled about them, obstructing any alternative path, as they attempted to follow the valley's edge in search of a different path. They had to either descend or go back to where the impossibly long road lay. With tremendous caution they descended, with the wagon slipping dangerously in several places. Every turn revealed a new track, more rocks, and a greater distance to the bottom, making the drop appear never-ending. When they eventually arrived at the valley's base and entered the fog, it enveloped them like a curtain, obstructing all but a few meters in front of them. The temperature fell sharply. Despite the blankets, they started to quiver with cold as their breath turned into white clouds. Sounds were muffled, as though every sound was absorbed by the fog. The horses' footsteps were hardly audible at all, and they discovered it in this mist, the others. Human shapes appeared and vanished in the mist, as figures strolled amid the trees. They continued strolling in slow circles on their aimless routes, seemingly oblivious to the couple. The woman had to cover her lips to keep from shouting when one of these figures came close enough to be seen clearly. The figure was an older version of herself, dressed in faded clothing and sporting gray hair. Perhaps imprisoned for years in that state, she strolled with a vacuous gaze, lost in the mist. Forgotten Valley. She wasn't alone either. Other forms emerged, all different incarnations of themselves at different ages, all lost or imprisoned, all wandering aimlessly in that hazy prison. The horse came to a complete stop when the man drew the rein hard. They couldn't keep moving forward in that mist, not with those ghosts of themselves prowling about. It seemed as though they were gazing into a dreadful future, a doom that would await them if they were unable to flee. The lady clutched her husband's arm, staring at one of the figures that bore a striking resemblance to her, but had a face carved with decades of weariness. They had to leave that valley. However, how? The wagon could not scale the high stone walls, and leaving the horse and their few possessions would make them much more exposed. The man searched his surroundings for anything that might point to a path out. He became aware that the fog wasn't uniform at that point. It contained currents, subtle gestures that implied the air was moving in a certain way. After getting off the cart, he took a few steps and felt the chilly mist on his face. Indeed, there was undoubtedly a current, as though the air was being drawn to something, possibly an entrance or a fissure in the rocks that could transport them. He returned, stepped back into the cart, and led the horse toward the current, following the mist's barely apparent movement. Around them, the figures kept coming and going. However, they started to shift. They were no longer merely elderly incarnations of the pair. They were also other persons. Strangers wearing clothing from many historical periods, all wearing the same vacant, lost look. Over the years, how many people have been stuck there? How many people were still lost and unable to find a way out? More closely than the rest, one of the figures came. The man was clothed in what appeared to be decades-old clothing, possibly from the previous century. His mouth moved as he extended his hand toward the carriage, attempting to talk, but nothing came out. There was a glimmer of desperation and pleading in his eyes. Fearing that touching one of these apparitions might also confine them in that existence, the pair accelerated their speed while avoiding contact. They became aware that they were climbing once more as the fog gradually cleared. They left the valley level behind as the land softly climbed. There was a renewed sense of hope. Maybe they were at last discovering a genuine escape route, one that would take them across that warped realm where they were imprisoned. However, when fully emerging from the fog, they discovered that the situation was even more bizarre than they had initially thought. They had returned to the original spot where they had awoken on that first improbable morning. The thick grass in the middle, the flawless circle of trees, and even the sun's position were all exactly the same, giving the impression that all of their wanderings and destinations had been part of a single, large loop that concluded precisely where it started. The woman started to chuckle, a pitiful chuckle born of mental fatigue. After walking for days, they saw things they couldn't have imagined, met versions of themselves, and ultimately found themselves back where they had begun. The hubby didn't chuckle. He got off the cart and made his way to the middle of the area in an attempt to find any indication that they could have overlooked earlier. At that moment, he noticed it on the ground, precisely in the clearing's geometric center. The ground had a mark on it. It wasn't organic, it was ideal. Where grass didn't grow, make a circle the size of a barrel lid. The earth within this circle had a peculiar texture, like molten glass that had solidified and was darker, nearly black. He dropped to his knees and touched the surface. It was flawlessly smooth and cooler than it should have been. He felt the earth give way little when he touched with his fingers, as though there were voids underneath. He called to the woman after giving her a quick glance. She arrived, still shaking, and they started to. They used their hands to dig around the dark circle. It was as though the soil had been purposefully loosened because it came away with ease. Within minutes, they had revealed what looked to be a solid metal lid that had been corroded over time. Something had been purposefully buried there, beneath the clearing where they had unintentionally slept, with hinges on one side and an iron ring on the other. A hatch. The lid sprang open with a loud creak of rusted metal as the man pulled the ring. There was a stone staircase. With time-worn steps, it stepped into the darkness. The smell of damp dirt and something else, something old and forgotten, filled the chilly air that rose from below. They exchanged glances, aware that this might be a trap, but also feeling that all the answers they were looking for were hidden there. The man got some dry twigs to construct a makeshift torch, while the woman took a lantern they had in the cart. They started down, light in their palms. The stairs were not level. The surrounding stone walls, some of which are nearly entirely eroded down, were covered in moist moss. With every step, the air became thicker and pressed on their chests. There was an underground cavern at the end of the stairway. It was small, maybe the size of a small room, but the walls were covered in symbols, the same patterns they had seen on the dead trees' burned wood, now inscribed in neat rows in the rock. A stone table with a book on it stood in the middle of the chamber. Considering its apparent antiquity, the book was remarkably well preserved. The cover had a brass clasp, was made of dark leather, and had no title. Slowly, the man moved closer and touched the surface. The leather had a tiny pulse and felt warm, as though it had its own life. He turned to face the woman who nodded. They couldn't go back now since they had gone too far. The book was filled with handwritten text in the same strange language as the symbols when he opened it. However, as he stared, the words started to shift, reorganizing themselves in front of his eyes and becoming readable Portuguese. The book seemed to, automatically translated, tailored to the reader. It was unsettling what was written. The novel characterized that location as a sort of intersection of realities, where the world's fabric was thin and other dimensions spilled into this one, rather than as a typical woodland. The cottage they had seen was a manifestation rather than a real building. It seemed to entice travelers and keep them caught in that never-ending cycle. The book had escape tactics, rituals, and directions, but it also featured cautions. Every individual who made an effort to depart left behind some aspect of themselves, including time, memories, and even pieces of their own lives. They had seen incarnations of themselves roaming because of this. They weren't illusions or ghosts. In earlier escape attempts that had not yet occurred, they were fragments of themselves that had already been abandoned. There, time wasn't linear. The man kept reading, looking for the answer, the way out, and he discovered it. However, the cost was exorbitant. To depart, one of them would need to remain long enough to seal the path by closing the portal, but not indefinitely. Only then would the other be able to follow, and both would resume their regular lives. However, whomever remained would have to confront whatever was in that intermediate area by themselves, even if only for a few seconds. As she read over his shoulder, tears welled up in her eyes. They would have to part ways, even if only temporarily, after coming together and surviving together. Feeling the weight of their choice, the man closed the book and gave her a hug. Must make. However, they were at least aware that they weren't entirely lost, and that there was a route out. They surfaced again, ascended the weathered steps, and came out into the clearing where the sun remained in its everlasting place. They didn't have much time to make a decision. The book had made it apparent that maintaining their identities would become more difficult the longer they were there. The choice was as heavy as a stone on their chests. They were seated next to each other on the peering into the darkness they had just left behind from the edge of the open hatch. Down there, the book waited, its pages containing secrets they could hardly fathom. The woman gripped her husband's hand tightly, as though she was afraid he might vanish if she let go for even a moment. They discussed what they had read in low tones. The instructions were intricate, containing precise information regarding placement, the precise time, and the phrases that had to be uttered. The substance, however, was straightforward and harsh. One would leave the area in a direction indicated by the stars at nightfall, while the other would return to the chamber and stay precisely in the middle of the circle of symbols. During rehearsals, the individual who stayed would have to recite the book's words, which were in an archaic language that they couldn't even pronounce correctly. Whoever was in the chamber would be exposed to everything that lived in that area between worlds over the course of the operation, which may take hours. The drawings on the edges of the book hinted to presences, beings that walked between those intermediary dimensions and were drawn to human consciousness like moths to a flame. Though the book didn't say exactly what may happen, the man was adamant about staying. Since he was brought up believing that he should defend, it came naturally to him that his job was to put himself in danger while ensuring the safety of others. However, the woman declined. She maintained that she would be better able to recall the precise words because she had a stronger memory. The exact gesture order outlined in the book. And that was true. He was aware that she had always been more adept at following intricate instructions and paying attention to details. They spent an endless amount of time arguing, each attempting to persuade the other to take the safer role. However, they ultimately came to a different understanding. Together, they would descend again and read the book more slowly until they had both fully committed it to memory. Then, at the last minute, they would make a decision based not on who was more courageous or competent, but on who felt better equipped at that particular moment. With fresh firewood for the torches and more light, they made their way back to the subterranean chamber. On the stone table, the book was waiting for them, apparently undamaged. However, they discovered that several pages had been altered when they opened it. There were now new diagrams, more thorough graphics that demonstrated proper placement, hand gestures, and even a depiction of the night sky with the stars they needed to refer to. They looked over every page with careful attention to detail, saying the words out loud until they could say them without faltering. When spoken, the odd phrases left a metallic aftertaste in their mouths and appeared to have originated far before any current language. When she uttered those old syllables, the woman realized that her voice echoed strangely, as though the walls themselves were reacting. As they studied, they discovered additional information about the camera that they had previously missed. There was more to the markings on the walls than merely ornamentation. They read a tale from top to bottom and left to right. Over the centuries, they put together a story about the travelers who had visited that location. Some had escaped, some had not, and those who had failed were still imprisoned, their shattered souls strewn all over the warped area. There was something very disturbing in one of the pictures. It was a depiction of several incarnations of the same individual, linked together like a web by thin threads. The main figure was whole, sturdy. However, those surrounding it became increasingly transparent and hollow. It was an illustration of the consequences of spending excessive amounts of time there. Even after the original person had left or ceased to exist entirely, fragments of their existence broke off, leaving behind echoes and shadows that kept wandering. A tingling feeling went up the man's arm as he touched one of the lines on the wall. It was more profound and basic than touching static electricity. He was dragged back by the woman, cautioning that direct interaction with the symbols outside of the required ceremony was not safe. The instructions had to be followed precisely as given, without any improvisation or curiosity that would cause them to make mistakes that could be disastrous. The time they spent in that room seemed to go on for hours. Even down there, time continued to act weirdly, appearing to drag on at times and rush quickly at others. They rehearsed the ceremonial motions, following the precise route on, the floor making precise, sequential touches to the walls. Every movement was exact, and every gesture was purposeful, almost like in a dance. They eventually believed they were prepared, or at least as prepared as they could be. The day had finally advanced as they ascended back to the surface. Now the sky was actually starting to become darker. It was a real twilight, with stars starting to come out. Not the fake darkness they'd known before. If it weren't for the awful context, everything they would require was ready. The woman used water from the adjacent brook to fill canteens. The man examined the cart and horse's condition. Until the rite was over, whoever was to leave the area had to be ready for a journey from which there was no way back. With what was left of their supplies, they ate a simple supper together, carefully, enjoying every morsel as though it were their last. They discussed the plans and their lives before to all of this while they were eating. They had the locations they desired to visit and the activities they envisioned. It was a somber but essential discussion, a means of reaffirming their identity before that location attempted to obliterate it. They recalled the reasons they had fallen in love, the small things that brought them joy, and the challenging times they had shared. The man used the graphic they had committed to memory from the book to identify the stars once they were sufficiently visible. In the sky, 3 particular stars formed a triangle, and the direction. The path they had to take was perpendicular to the triangle's base. He gestured and showed it to the woman, telling her that if she were the one to leave the area, she would likewise know exactly where to go. The choice suddenly came to itself in that flash of insight beneath the stars. The woman just knew after meeting her husband's gaze. He was also aware. No additional debate or discussion took place. She would remain since, at that particular time, she felt completely. Assurance that it was her responsibility, and he acknowledged and respected that assurance despite his want to object. They spent a long time cuddling, remembering each other's warmth, aroma, and the sensation of being in each other's company. Both of them had tears in their eyes when they parted ways, but they were also determined. They were going to pull it off. There was nothing else they could do, but above all, even if they were apart for a short time, they had each other. With additional torches in hand, the woman made one final descent into the chamber and the book she had chosen to carry so she could be certain of every word. Watching her go down the weathered steps, the man stood on the edge of the hatch. He gave her a short but meaningful wave when she got to the bottom and looked up. He started to close the hatch after she waved back, but he paused in the middle. He had to say something he couldn't keep from saying. His voice reverberated down the stairs as he summoned her. "No matter what happens, no matter how long," he said. He would return to her if it took. He would return even if it meant traversing 1,000 unfeasible jungles and confronting entire dimensions of terror. And she said that she knew, down there in the shadows softly lighted by torches. She was always aware. The metal gave a final creak and then snapped into position as he fully closed the hatch. Then, following the directions, he covered it with the earth, leaving only a faint imprint that only he could identify. He got inside the cart and once again looked at the stars. More, and led the horse out of the clearing. He didn't turn around. That was made clear in the instructions. He kept his gaze forward since turning around would disrupt the ceremony and doom them both to eternal imprisonment. Down below, in the subterranean chamber, the woman opened the book and started reading, following the path indicated by the stars as the clearing vanished behind him, surrounded by woods. She spoke steadily, carefully pronouncing each old word, and following the floor's pattern as directed. As she performed each stage of the ceremony, the walls started to softly glow, with the symbols lighting up one by one. She could also sense presences coming from somewhere in the shadows outside the torches, attracted by the energy being produced. However, she continued, she didn't think twice. In order for them both to finally make their way back home, she kept reading, walking, and performing her duties. The man had a broken heart but a sharp mind as he made his way through the jungle. The trees around them appeared to have changed. Less menacing, as though the ceremony had already started to change the place's character. Although the shadows continued to dance among the trunks, the sense of continuous scrutiny had vanished. Additionally, the horse appeared calmer, trotting steadily and displaying none of the anxiety it had before displayed. Keeping his gaze fixed on the stars, he changed direction whenever the route required it. The book had been unambiguous. For each degree, the course had to be kept as accurate as feasible. His wife might have to spend more hours alone in the room as a result of the deviation. His gut tightened at the idea of her down there, surrounded by glistening symbols and invisible forces, but he had faith in her strength and capacity to complete the task at hand. Gradually, the forest started to transform. Both the density of the trees and the amount of dead vegetation on the ground decreased. For the first time since they had woken up, he was able to see farther and differentiate things on the horizon. Up in that unattainable clearing. He started to notice indications that they were getting closer to the real world. A mound of stones here that might indicate an old property line, a shattered fence here that was clearly constructed by actual human hands. The air, however, saw the biggest shift. He sensed a change in the wind's nature and the aroma it carried. The still, heavy air of the magical woodland had vanished. It was actual air bearing the scents of pine trees, freshly rained ground, and even a faint tinge of civilization, woodsome smoke, and actual people going about their daily lives. Eager to get over that invisible line between the impossible and the real, he accelerated his horse's pace, but he made himself keep going in the right direction. Now that they were so near, he couldn't allow haste to ruin everything. The urge to stray would be strongest in the last seconds, as the book had warned, and the temptation materialized. He noticed lights to his right, but they weren't the false light of thee. There were several lights, clear and steady, the kind that could only come from a city or village, but the cabin was disappeared. His entire being urged him to go in that direction, to look for assistance and people. However, he remained steadfast and trusted the ceremony his wife was performing, as well as the book's instructions. He proceeded in the direction suggested by the stars, as the lights behind him dimmed. The ground started to rise, creating a low hill with tall grass growing on it. He stopped briefly upon reaching the summit and gazed back at the entire woodland rather than the clearing he had just left. From a distance, in the starlight, It appeared to be simply another area of Missouri hills covered by woods. There was nothing about it that hinted at the horrors inside. He sensed a profound change in the world around him as he proceeded down the opposite side of the hill. He experienced a change in his physique that was similar to passing through a curtain of cold water. The colors were more vibrant, and the air felt lighter. The sounds are more distinct, even in the dark. He was over. He was back in the real world after leaving that warped place. He nearly passed out from the sheer relief. He had to stop the cart in order to recover control as his trembling hands gripped the handlebars. However, the momentary relief was quickly followed by intense anxiety. What about his wife? He was out. Did the ritual succeed? Was she secure? He couldn't possibly know. Not quite yet. He would have to wait, according to the instructions. Until daybreak. He wouldn't know whether the rite was successful until the sun rose. All he could do was wait and believe till then. For the longest vigil of his life, he located a level area next to the route, built a little fire, and took a seat. Slowly, the hours went by. He pondered of his wife while tending to the fire and observing the stars as they moved across the sky. He pictured her in the room, reciting those old phrases, following the instructions, and remaining resilient in the face of any threat. For the first time in years, he prayed. I prayed for her safety to whoever might be listening. He started to doubt his own memories as he waited. No matter how long it had actually been, the events of the previous few hours or days seemed to be getting more and more blurry. Though the specifics were fading, he could still recall the cabin, the clearing, and the underground chamber. It was the cost of passage, as the text had explained. Memories that were left behind. Bits and pieces of an experience that were unable to completely return to everyday life. He grabbed some charcoal from the bonfire and started sketching on the ground next to him. He sketched the hatch, the symbols, and the camera. He captured whatever he could recall before it vanished entirely. Although they were rudimentary scrawls, they served to anchor the memories, gave you a tangible object to cling to as the memories attempted to fade. A tiny strip of bluish light gradually grew larger as the sky lightened in the east. The man got to his feet, his muscles hurting from prolonged sitting. He turned to face the trees, which was where he had come from, was reduced to a dark mass against the sky's increasing brightness. His heart was racing as he waited for some indication that everything had gone smoothly. The environment was painted in pink and gold tones as the light grew. Then he noticed her, a figure coming out of the tree, stumbling a little but undoubtedly moving in his direction. He pushed through the long grass and began to run, abandoning the cart. He could see it was his wife as he got closer. She was tired and coated in filth, but she was real and alive. They got together in the midst of the field, giving each other a painful embrace. She was shaking from relief and tiredness, not from the cold. Hugging her and uttering useless consoling words, he was just glad to have her back. He noticed that she had altered when they eventually parted enough to meet eyes. Her gaze was odd, as though she had witnessed something that no person should. She attempted to speak, but her voice was hardly audible. After returning her to the cart, he gave her water and covered her with blankets. After taking a slow sip and moistening her throat, she started narrating her tale. It hadn't been simple, but the ceremony had worked. As the procedure went on, the presences she had sensed in the chamber grew closer and closer. Even though she had never met them in person, she could sense their interest in her, their need to touch her and learn more about her. She claimed that there was a time when she was on the verge of giving in to dread, when the walls appeared to start closing in, and when the symbols were so bright she could hardly see them. Despite every instinct telling her to run, she persisted, word for word, step for step, trusting the process. Then, all of a sudden, nothing happened. The hatch above her opened on its own, the light went out, and the presences faded. When she had ascended, the clearing was deserted, the sun had risen, and there was no trace of the twisted forest that had imprisoned them, only ordinary undergrowth, through which she could plainly see the path back to reality. She had discovered him by taking that route, awaiting. For a long time, they sat there simply taking in everything that had transpired. Now that the sun was high in the sky, they were surrounded by warmth and brilliant light. Despite the terror they had just experienced, the world carried on as usual. The wind blew softly, and birds sang. Life carried on as usual. After a while, everyone stood up and got the wagon ready to travel. They gave the forest they had come from one final glance, only a green haze on the horizon at this point. A part of them wished it had. All been a common dream or a delusion brought on by fatigue or disease. However, it had been real, as evidenced by the charcoal drawings on the ground, the blankets they had brought from the lost cottage, and the memories they still possessed, however dimly. Now that the road was plainly and distinctly in front of them, the pair followed it. It was a real road with the marks of several horsets and carts. In a way, they had nearly forgotten was possible. The earth had found its purpose again. All the trees were trees. Every darkness is only, nothing more than the lack of light. They seemed to have forgotten how to live in a world with regular laws, which was both weird and comfortable. For the first few hours of the trip, they didn't say much. They mutually understood that they needed some time to process, to allow their thoughts to return to normalcy. The woman repeatedly examined her own hands, flipping them over in the sunlight as though to make sure they remained solid, that she was still real, and complete. The man followed suit, using his hands to secure himself by touching the wood of the cart, the horse's neck, the rails, and other nearby things. The real oddity of their experience emerged when they started interacting with other people. They were hailed joyfully by a farmer who was driving by with a cart full of hay and remarked on how nice the weather was for travel. On a typical morning, they appeared to him to be just another traveling couple. He failed to notice the strain in their bodies, the shadows in their eyes, were unaware of the chasm they had traversed. They responded courteously, maintaining a quick and surface-level exchange. How could they explain? To someone who had never known anything other than the cozy normalcy of the ordinary life, how could they ever explain what they had gone through? It would be like attempting to explain music to someone who has never heard a sound or colors to someone who was born blind. They later made a halt to get supplies in a tiny settlement. While the male entered a store, the woman took care of the wagon and horse. Inside, amid the carefully organized shelves of everyday items, jars of preserves and bags of grain, she felt such a strong sense of alienation that she had to rest against the counter. Everything appeared both completely foreign and familiar at the same time, as though she had forgotten what it meant to make purchases, trade commodities for cash, and live in a civilized society. The salesperson, an elderly woman with a warm grin, inquired about her well-being. The female, coerced A, grinned, and stated that she was simply worn out from the journey. The salesperson nodded sympathetically and mentioned that there was a lot of mud on the back roads, making the roads challenging at this time of year. The woman clung to the casual chats about everyday topics like a lifeline, using them as a means of bringing herself back to reality. The long stillness was finally broken by the man as they left the settlement and continued their trek. They must decide what to do with what they know, he stated, with their experiences. Should they try to warn other tourists about that location by telling someone, or should they keep it a secret among themselves because it's too personal, too intimate, or too horrible to discuss? Before responding, the woman gave it considerable thought. She claimed that a part of her wanted to yell and tell everyone they encountered to never, ever go near that specific forest or secret area. Another portion, however, was aware that no one would take them seriously. They would be viewed as insane, maybe dangerous, unreliable, and, worse, they might draw the very people who shouldn't go there, the inquisitive, the doubtful, and those who needed to see for themselves if they presented the story too convincingly. They came to an agreement. They wouldn't try to make the incident public. However, if they ever came across someone who was going to go in that direction, in that particular region of the Ozarks, they would discreetly warn them, recommend that they take a different path, and casually note that those routes were particularly deceitful, tiny actions that might save lives without subjecting them to mockery or worse. The recollections faded at the margins as the days went by as they moved farther and farther away from that area. They were less immediate and less obvious, but they did not entirely vanish. It resembled peering through frosted glass. You were aware of its presence. The details were hazy, but the overall outline was discernible. The man attempted to sketch the symbols of the chamber multiple times, but soon they were just meaningless lines on paper, with each attempt capturing less of the original essence. The woman found that she was unable to recall the precise terms of the rite she had carried out. She was aware that she had read something and that she had recited ancient syllables, but when she woke up, they had vanished from her memory like dreams. The thought that something so basic and vital to her livelihood could just vanish disturbed her. However, it also brought a certain relief. Maybe it was better to forget than to carry that knowledge with you forever. At last, they reached the southern city where they had planned to search for employment. A small, tidy room with a window overlooking the main street served as their humble lodging in a boarding house. They slept in a real bed inside 4 sturdy walls that would remain till dawn that first night. They each woke up multiple times in a panic to make sure the other was still there and that everything was well. Remained genuine. As the days stretched into weeks, they started to develop a rhythm. As predicted, the man was able to secure employment in a sawmill. The woman started creating new items on demand and mending clothing for nearby families. They clung to this normalcy with intense thankfulness because they led basic, everyday lives, exactly the kind of life they had sought when they set out on that fatal journey. However, there were times when something drew them back, generally in peaceful periods. A certain shadow pattern on the wall could remind them of the symbols in the chamber. On other evenings, the murmur they had heard among the dead trees was echoed by the wind, and sometimes they came back in dreams. They went back to that clearing, to that cabin that was both real and imaginary, to that area between worlds where time did not move as it should, and where different incarnations of themselves continued to roam aimlessly. They were aware of each other's dreams, but they never had a direct conversation about them. There was a particular appearance in the dawn, a faint tension that only subsided a few hours later, confirming the stability of their surroundings. They were especially considerate and watchful of one another on those days, as though they were reminded of what they had nearly lost and what they might still lose if they weren't watchful. A few months after they had made their home, a tourist showed up at the boarding house one afternoon. He intended to travel north, passing through the exact area of the Ozarks where everything had occurred. The couple looked at each other meaningfully. For the first time, they were able to carry out their pledge to discreetly warn someone. During supper, the man casually inquired about the traveler's journey and struck up a conversation. The man offered substitutes when the traveler indicated the particular trails he intended to utilize. He claimed to have heard that the trails were often confused, the area was very challenging to travel, and it would be safer to follow even if it was longer, the major road. The traveler stated he would take the advice into consideration and thanked him for it. They never found out if the man took the advice. The following morning, he departed, and they watched with a mix of hope and fear as he vanished down the road. I hope he will take the most secure route. Fear that if he didn't, someone else would have to deal with what they had. Life continued. In the city, they became friends and integrated into the community. People observed them as a calm, diligent pair that are dependable, kind, and maybe a touch reticent. Nobody had any idea that the world was not as solid as it appeared, that there were hidden layers and folds where other things lived and waited, or that beneath those ordinary facades was an event that had profoundly and irreversibly changed how they perceived reality. They occasionally pondered the other persons they had seen in that place on the gloomiest nights when the wind was particularly fierce and the shadows were dancing in particular ways. Valley was overlooked. Those lost wandering figures were strangers from different ages, older versions of themselves. How many had eventually gotten away? How many people were still caught in that never-ending cycle? And if they wondered, with a chill that could not be comforted by a blanket, whether some part of them was still there too, if the versions they had seen walking continued to live in some parallel world, caught in a never-ending cycle of repeat. They were unable to confirm or deny the idea, so it lingered on the periphery of their awareness like an enduring shadow. Above all, though, they had one another. They had endured what ought to have been impossible together, shared something that no one else would share, and that bonded them in a way that went beyond simple love. It was a bond created by survival, tempered by the horrifying realization that reality was much less secure and considerably stranger than most people had thought. The years went by as life typically does when it settles into a routine. Staying in that metropolis, the couple created a life that was both typical and exceptional. For everyone who knew them, they were ordinary, yet their silent secret made them exceptional. Together, they got older, their hands worn from labor, their hair going gray. Yet their eyes never lost the unique sparkle of people who could see past the surface of everyday life. One of them would mutter about those particular 3 stars that formed a triangle while they sat on their modest house's porch and watched the stars whirl in the sky. The other person was constantly aware of which ones they were, even without looking. They served as markers on a trip that no map could ever capture, landmarks engraved into their spirits. They never went back to that area, more out of respect than out of fear. They had paid their price, left their belongings behind, and earned the right to continue on without turning around. There were areas of the world that should be left peaceful, boundaries that should only be crossed once in a lifetime. Occasionally, in late-night talks before going to bed, they would conjecture as to the nature of their discovery. Was it a door that opened and closed in accordance with rules they didn't comprehend, or was it something old that had always existed, or something that came and went throughout time? They only ever came up with deeper questions, never answers. However, these discussions were consoling. They felt reassured that they weren't the only ones with fading recollections. After the man had been carrying the burnt wood for so long, it finally fell apart entirely. He stored it in a tiny box, and when he opened it one day, all he saw were ashes. The last tangible remnants of his experience had disappeared along with the symbols. Strangely, though, this provided tranquility, as though that item were the final physical connection to that location, and its disintegration ultimately released them from any chance of being drawn back. Occasionally they came across other visitors arranging routes through the far-off mountains, and they always kindly suggested different routes, never with a sense of hurry that might. Suspicion, merely with the informal knowledge of individuals who were familiar with the routes. Every time they did this, they questioned if they were saving lives or just delaying unavoidable meetings with the unexplainable. Many years later, they passed close to that area one final time. They didn't mean to, but events forced them to travel in a direction that brought them near the hills they knew only dimly. They could have looked for that chamber of blazing symbols, that clearing, that hidden hatch. However, they decided not to. Once closed, some doors must stay closed. Rather, they stood at the forest's edge and observed how the trees moved with the breeze. They might have thought they saw smoke rising between the branches, a thin line of pale gray against the sky for a split second. A mutual understanding passed between them as they exchanged glances. The location remained intact. It continued to do what it always did. It was no longer theirs, but it still waited for tired travelers in need of cover. Issue. They were on the run. They were still alive. The fact that they had established a life on the opposite side was sufficient proof of success. They left that chapter of their lives behind, a tale they would only share with one another on the gloomiest nights when the wind blew in a particular direction. They turned their backs on the forest and continued on their journey. The novel concludes with the straightforward realization that certain riddles are not intended to be fully understood, rather than with conclusive explanations or conclusions. Certain locations are on the edge of reality, waiting, observing, drawing in people who get disoriented at the wrong time. And those who are fortunate enough to escape take something deeper with them, rather than proof or evidence. The unwavering conviction that, even while sitting comfortably in one's own home, the world is considerably more bizarre, far wider, and far more impossible. If you've traveled this far with us, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like for more stories that will make you consider the nature of reality. Additionally, the next time you witness smoke coming from. If you find yourself on a lonely road somewhere unexpected, you might want to reconsider before exploring. Certain doors are alluring because you shouldn't open them until the next.